When I was growing up, some of my most powerful memories when I was out on the land interacting with wildlife. Bison are just built for this place, this geography that is North America. As far as we were rotating our bison, trying to regenerate the land through bison grazing. A lot of landscapes are not set up to be a year-round cow-calf herd,
This is Decentralized Radio. I'm Tristan.
And I'm Ryan.
The goal of this podcast is to help educate you on how to live your most optimal life. We will host industry expert guests to shed light on topics that matter.
We are not gurus, rather two individuals who have had to pave their own path to health and vitality, independent of the centralized systems that plague modern society.
All right, we are live on Decentralized Radio here in Wyoming at my lovely house with Cody Spencer. Cody, how's it going, man?
Oh, man, doing great. First time in Thermopolis, beautiful place. Just crushed some burgers with you, and yeah, life is good.
Yeah, we glad we had this opportunity. You texted me. I was on top of a mountain, and you're like, "Oh, just let me know because I need to decide to drive separate." So I'm glad this worked out so well. And toured the bison ranch today, which was cool. So I have to talk a little bit about that. But why don't you introduce yourself to the audience as well? I think you have a really cool background and experience I'll have to get into. But what would you say that you do for a living?
So I'm Cody Spencer, and I would say that I'm a bison manager, an agroecologist. So, to unpack what that means, first and foremost, we manage bison, and we manage them in a way that improves the health of the land, and we producing a nutrient-dense food product from that and getting it into the hands of consumers. And so, I've been on this journey of bison management for about 10 years now, and that's kind of taken me, down a few different roads, a bunch of different locations. I'm from Alberta, Canada, so southern Alberta. So for your American listeners, if you're familiar with where Glacier Park is in Montana, we're just north of that, along the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And so we're based out of there, and I do work with bison ranchers and cattle producers in the regenerative space, primarily across the Western North American landscape to see how we can regenerate the land and bring back bison.
Yeah, I think it's so cool what you do. And that's obviously something I've gotten into pretty recently, pretty passionately the past few years. Bison for me is just they're just more magical, native, large ruminant, North America. It's just something that captures, a feeling in you that you can't really describe or achieve with cattle, I think, personally. But how'd you get into bison?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'm 33 years old. I grew up on a farm, a kind of a mixed farm near the Montana border. So I was always around agriculture and hunting as a kid. And so that really imprinted in me and just living that kind of lifestyle out on the land. And when I was an early teenager, my family sold the farm for, a bunch of different reasons. It was the right decision to make at the time. And we were, we kind of moved an hour away outside of a medium-sized city. And so we kind of became disconnected from the land for a few years. And when I was in my late teens, I decided I wanted to get back into hunting because, man, when I was growing up, some of my most powerful memories when I was out on the land interacting with wildlife, and it was just this feeling I had. And so I was just kind of drawn back out onto the land, and so I started hunting and getting back out on where we live is the northern Great Plains. Where they meet the Rocky Mountains. And so, we still have pockets of wild landscapes, prairie grasslands, foothills, mountains, where we've got mule deer, elk, moose, pronghorn antelope, all these megafauna species. And as I was out there doing this, bow hunting primarily was the thing that really hooked me because you have to get so intimate with the animal. And so, you have to be really in tune with your environment. And so the more and more time I was spending out on those landscapes, I just got thinking about bison and why aren't they still here? That was the question that I started with. And it's like, okay, well, I know they're not extinct, right? Because we see them from time to time, and yeah, they're in Yellowstone, and we've got some parks in Canada, and I knew that, like, I had a neighbor when I was growing up that had a few, and so it was like, okay, well, this is interesting. And then one time my mom, I went over to visit my mom's house, and she had this coffee table book called Portraits of the Bison, and it was written by a guy named Wes Olson. And I picked up that book and started flipping through it, and I was just blown away. I was hooked right there. Like, wow, these animals are so amazing. And, you read into the backstory that everybody's heard about them being nearly exterminated. We almost lost them. There was a few hundred animals left on the entire continent, the entire world. And they've made this recovery. And basically right there, it was like, I need to figure out how to be involved with these animals. And that's what kicked it off for me.
Yeah, I think that's super powerful. It's such a cool story, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, we were just talking about before hunting, something I just got into last year, and yeah, I mean, like, I'm hooked, right? Like, I just want to be in it. I don't know how else to describe it. Like, I just want to be more connected with nature, and I think hunting gives you that experience. Excited
so primal.
Yeah, I'm excited to bow hunt this year for the first time. Because you got to get even closer and get even more intimate, and get in the rut with the elk. Can't even wait for that kind of experience. So I can totally see how that transition happened. But yeah, the bison. I mean, it's really like a shame that we kind of pretty much just like replaced all the bison with cattle, and we don't even know. Well, we know the effect that like industrial farming and overgrazing and feedlot animals has had on the soil quality in North America. But in general, it's just, a mismatch from, what their really biology is probably primed for. And I'm curious what you think in general in terms of, ranching bison. It's kind of a weird thing, right? They're like, some people call them semi-wild, right? Like, they've only been domesticated for, 100 years. Do you think it's something that's, really great and that you'd love to see it continue to grow? Like, is it scalable in terms of, do you think it'll ever compete with cattle? And should it? Or, because I think the alarming figure that, people don't really understand is there's 200,000 maybe ranched bison, I think, in the US, or in Canada, maybe 300,000. And there's like 150,000 cattle that are slaughtered every day. So it's like, we're not even like, it's so small, it's incomprehensible.
Yeah. So there's a million questions that you laid out there, and this is a huge
subject.
No, it's all good. This is probably my favorite topic. And so I would say that we look at, first off, I want to say that it is what it is. Cattle, that all happened. The atrocities that were, committed against indigenous people and replacing bison on the landscape with cattle. It's horrible, but it happened. And so here we are, 150 years later, and there's a movement to bring bison back onto the landscape. And I think that is great. I think that's amazing. So then the question becomes, how do you do that? And really, once you start to dig down into that question, you got to identify, okay, so where is it suitable to actually bring bison back onto the landscape? And, there's a lot of studies that have been done in the grassland conservation world about where on the North American continent do we still have large blocks of unfragmented habitat. So, and we look to the Great Plains, we look to, largely across the North American West for these areas. And, a lot of that landscape has been occupied by cattle ranching for the last 150 years. And for better or for worse, cattle ranching in its traditional, conventional sense is dying out. And the people who are adapting to it are generally practicing more regenerative type management and shifting their style of grazing management with their cattle to mimic the way that the bison used to graze. So when we look at how do we get bison back on the land, in most cases, we're dealing with a landscape that's been ranched, it's been fenced, and there's neighbors on the outside, there's highways, there's towns, there's cities, there's all these man-made things and barriers to bison. And, historically, they would have moved thousands of miles in a single season. That's really what their instincts tell them to do. They need that. They love that. And so that poses a big challenge for managing bison in the modern context. Back to these large landscapes, there's really only a few places on the continent where it's still suitable for bison to range free roaming across, political boundaries, roads, towns, cities. Yellowstone's one of them. They still get persecuted when they try to go into Montana. That's not perfect. We've got some places in Alberta, a place called Wood Buffalo National Park. It's 10 times the size of Yellowstone, and it's completely wild, and they're totally free ranging. But that's in the boreal forest. It's not the Great Plains where we had these massive herds. So when we look at, if we take a ranch, a big ranch that might be, say, anywhere from 1,000 to some large ranches out there can still be several 100,000 acres. These are still large landscapes, but they still have to be fenced to contain the bison. Because, if you or I were investing our time and money into getting these animals back on the land, we don't want them to just run onto a highway and get killed and we get sued and all those things. And so we have to work within that context. And each piece of land is different. So how we go about that, rotating the animals through what land base we have, is totally context specific based on that piece of land. And to me, that is like a fascinating puzzle piece to try to look at a piece of land and say, okay, how do we do this in a way that A, we regenerate the land, we improve the land. B, how do we respect the bison and their needs and their animal health and their performance? And if we're in a ranching situation, then we need to be profitable as well. So we need our animals to be healthy and putting on weight. Eventually they're going to be, feeding us. I myself, I don't know what percentage of my diet would be grass-fed bison that I raise, but it's probably up around 50%, and it has been for years. So my body is literally made up of these proteins from this animal. So that's a critical piece that if we just say, oh yeah, this needs to be a wild herd and no human can have an interaction with them and it's just for display or something, I don't think that's right. And I think a lot of the indigenous populations who are reintroducing bison to their tribal lands, they would say the same thing, that connection between the human and the animal and the land is critical.
Yeah, I mean, it's just there's no way with the modern society that we can just go back to having bison range across states, and but it's important to know that that's what they did, right? Because what wasn't it called? A black cloud would just come across the horizon and graze every piece of grass, and then they might not come back for years. And that's just not possible anymore. I mean, it's like a pipe dream, right? And I've talked about it with other people. I'd be so sick to have maybe from Cody, Wyoming, and come down and find somehow that there's a route on BLM land, or you get a coalition of landowners that are on board. That would be awesome. Is that actually feasible? I don't know. Probably pretty challenging. But, having the native large ruminant on its native soils and land seems great to me. And although, it's probably a bit more challenging for ranchers, to me, I think it's for sure a great thing, like you're saying. So I guess the question is, what are the advantages of raising bison versus cattle, and what are the disadvantages? If someone wanted to get into this, or they're just, listening and curious, what are the trade-offs?
Totally. That's a great question, because there are both of those things for sure. So starting with the advantages, I mean, bison are just built for this place, this geography that is North America. Extreme colds, temperatures down to minus 40 degrees. I'm Canadian, so Celsius and Fahrenheit, that's where they meet, is minus 40. And bison don't even bat an eye at that temperature. Their metabolism slows right down. They kind of go into like this semi like hibernation state and just ride it out. They love it, quite frankly. They love the cold. They thrive in it. And that's one thing with cattle. They're just not built for that. And a cold stretch of really frigid temperatures can just wipe out a cattle herd, or at least put a lot of stress on them. They consume more feed and forage when they're in that state, whereas bison, they don't. They just kind of, their metabolism settles into that, and they just ride it out. So that's huge, especially in the northern climates, like where I live, and even you get fairly cold here. And then on the flip side of that, they tolerate heat really well, which is not something that people realize, and it's kind of mind-boggling. But people don't realize that bison are native all the way down into Chihuahua, Mexico. So they've existed in the deep south for a long time. Granted, they had migratory patterns where they could go up high into mountains during, extreme heat and stuff like that. But their ability to tolerate heat is really, really high. I was just out at the Durham Ranch near Gillette, Wyoming this past week doing some consulting work with them. And they were talking about how they held some sort of an infrared camera on the bison, and it was extremely hot. I mean, it was like probably 90 degrees, and you'd think that a big, furry, shaggy animal would just be dying and cooking to death. But something, I forget what the camera was, but basically the whole point was their hair was insulating from the heat as well. And so their actual internal body temperature was just fine. It was normal, and they were completely content and thriving. So I think their adaptability to extremes is one of the first things that really sets bison apart. One major advantage over cattle, especially if you're raising breeding animals and they're calving, is that with bison, there's zero work involved with calving. On the cattle ranching side, most traditional ranchers are out there pulling calves, trying to keep these things alive. Sometimes they're even calving in the middle of winter, which is insane. More and more people are shifting away from that, but there's still a lot of ranchers that calve in the middle of February, even January. And so you can imagine all the problems that are associated with that. It's just insane. So bison, they are completely on a natural cycle where they rut and breed and starting about right now in the middle of July. And then they have their calves starting maybe late April, or and the bulk of it is in the month of May, and then you'll have a few come in into June. And another interesting thing about how bison calve is that in the springtime, like especially on the northern plains, we can have these late spring storms that roll in and dump a bunch of snow on the ground and be, kind of nasty, shitty weather. And bison they can sense that the storm is coming, and they will hold off calving, and they will ride it out until that storm passes, and then boom, the calves start coming. So they're just so much more in tune. You mentioned domestication. They really aren't domesticated. That certain herds have their behaviors more adapted to the humans that they're around on a day-to-day basis, but genetically they're not domesticated yet. I think the more and more the bison ranching industry moves ahead, and especially if we're taking this cattle mindset of selective traits and all of these things, then I think we'll get there, which I don't think is a good thing, which is why it's important to have wild herds.
Yeah, I just want to chime in there because, domestication, I guess that's a definition that I've never even really thought of. But to me, it's like these generations of actually, you're kind of picking traits, like you're saying, but they're picking docile animals, right? That are kind of they're not the ones breaking out of the herd, or they're not the ones like giving you trouble. Which to me is like, yeah, you're basically eliminating some wildness and natural
gene
instinct
that would allow them to thrive in nature.
Yeah. So you're saying that's not a good thing. And that makes a lot of sense. Cause I mean, if you want to keep it true as like, the bison are this badass animal that's, actually wild, they just happen to be on a ranch now. If you keep making them more and more docile generation over generation, like, yeah, you'll eventually end up with a domesticated animal.
Yeah. And that, I don't know how we will reconcile that as the bison ranching industry, because at anybody that's dealt with bison that are jumping fences and just generally causing, a lot of havoc, it's a pain in the ass to deal with, and it causes a lot of stress and financial issues. So those animals generally get culled out of the herd. So I don't know. That's an interesting thing of which is why it's important to maintain wild herds that generally don't have any of that selection pressure from humans. So, ranching bison in that sense isn't perfect. We're not living in a fairy tale fantasy land. We're here in reality in 2023 trying to figure out, how do we do this? How do we bring these animals back on the land? And so, I mean, that kind of brings it to the challenges.
The downsides,
yeah. So generally speaking, bison are...
Hey, friend. Thanks for listening. If you really enjoy this podcast, it would be really appreciated if you left us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple, or subscribe to our content on YouTube. This helps us get to a larger reach and a larger audience to spread this wonderful free education.
They're very gentle creatures. A lot of people, have this perception from seeing people getting gored in Yellowstone Park like every week.
Yellowstone highlight reels, my favorite.
Yeah, right? People see that and they're like, oh my God, bison are crazy and they're super aggressive and they're all these things, which they're not in general. It's when they're put in a stressful situation, their back's against the wall, they're defending a calf. They're, old bison bulls are just grumpy assholes, and they will, like, if you go to engage with them, they know that they are bigger than you, and they will, they'll stand their ground, rightfully so. So, with that being said, they are a very gentle creature, but they're extremely athletic. And if you have them in a ranched setting, and by ranched, I guess I mean fenced in, contained, which can also mean, all of the tribal herds that are being restored. I shouldn't say all. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but most of them are still fenced. Even on tribal lands, most conservation herds, quote unquote, a lot of national park herds, they're all fenced. So then within that context, if we're not providing what they need, then they'll start to get agitated and want to find a way out of the fences. And so, what do they need? Well, they need good quality forage, feed, grass, forbs. They're predominantly grazers, so they need a lot of good quality grass. And they need good water. Mineral is also important depending on the situation, but generally we want a good mineral program. Those three things, and low stress. So just, if we're putting them in a situation where they're out of feed, they don't have good forage, they have poor quality water or not enough water, and we're stressing them and they don't have mineral, then they're going to start to get agitated. And that's when they start to put pressure on fences. And, you always hear, oh, bison can jump 6-foot fence from a standstill. And yeah, I get, it's possible that they can do that, but generally speaking, they're not going to just go jump a 6-foot fence from a standstill. Cattle are no different. If they're put in that same situation, they're going to try to find a way out to meet their needs. So, when it comes down to it, bison fencing does need to be a little bit bigger than cattle fencing. So we generally approach a situation and look at a 50 to 54 inch top wire, which is a little bit bigger than a cattle fence. that can be played with depending on the skill of the managers and how they're, working that grass and water formula. So if you have a really good manager and you know how to have a good relationship with your herd and keep them content, then the fences, they don't need to be as high. But if you're a really poor manager and you're just letting them overgraze and they're out of feed and they have really bad water, then you're probably going to need a Jurassic Park fence to keep them in or to be able to sleep at night. And it's anywhere in between. So though, those are some challenges. I think another challenge is that they're not this commodity that beef is, as they should not be a commodity. But as far as managing them, it's not like if say you're in a drought situation, and it's the middle of summer, it's not like there's an auction mart like down the block where you can just like unload your bison. So being able to on say the marketing or the animal, managing where the animals go and managing for drought, that's a little bit more difficult as well.
Yeah, I think the infrastructure piece is interesting, and I know we talked about that earlier today as well. And it seems like if you really have a great setup, the chances of a bison breaking fence or breaking out could be really minimized, which makes sense to me. And you're talking about training them with the electric fencing too, and it's all kind of this mentality and training them to respect boundaries and then being low stress. So yeah, I guess that's a nuance that people probably don't consider. And it's easy to think that a bison's just gonna break out no matter what, but maybe the management style is really what's dictating that. So also probably the herd size, I guess, just from an odds perspective would be probably something also that's important there. But yeah, getting into that, I think it's good that bison is a niche, but we've seen this tremendous growth in the industry, the past 10, 20 years. How did that come about? And, is that something, consumers are really it seems like consumers are excited. Bison is in supermarkets now, and we can talk about, maybe the downsides of the bison industry that people probably don't know about. But yeah, what really was the moving force behind, this growth of bison ranching?
Yeah, I guess I would say that bison ranching, as far on the production side, hasn't really grown that much. I think it's actually on the decline. But so I'm saying that in the 90s there was this huge excitement about bison, and a lot of people got into the industry, and it was this big buzz, and people were paying thousands of dollars for breeding stock, a lot of money for breeding stock. And then there was no market to back it up. It was still and you would still run into people today where it's oh yeah, bison's an exotic animal, isn't it? It's well, it's actually the least exotic animal ever. And they would lump it in with ostrich and things like that. It still is
considered exotic.
Yeah,
by
the
USDA.
Right. And it's just the most bizarre thing, right? And so that kind of grew, and then there was a bubble because there was no market to back it up. And so then in the early 2000s, bison industry was really not a good business to be in. And then starting maybe 2005, it started to pick up and up. And we eventually hit a peak of, I guess, I don't know if you'd call it a bubble, but you hit a peak in the bison industry around it was right around the time that COVID hit. So the production, I don't think, has really increased that much. And there's, in fact, a lot of older producers who got in that first wave and kind of rode it out. They're getting old, and they're kind of turning over now. And but I think what you're referring to is this consumer awareness and the consumer's taste in bison. Because I think you're right. I think that's been growing steadily since then. And I think it really kind of started to build within the early paleo movement, and people started looking for high quality protein, high quality red meats, and bison's just such a natural fit, right? for, if there's somebody who's really into improving their health, maybe don't have the resources or the skill to learn how to hunt themselves, then like going out and sourcing bison is a perfect fit.
Yeah, I think that, and I don't know. I mean, I think there's like a shit ton of more people just going to Yellowstone and like national parks.
That
and
could be
maybe just like awareness of what, I mean, if you ask someone in like 2002 what a bison was in New York City, would they actually know? I doubt it.
Yeah.
Now there's, Yellowstone, that's TV show. Like, I feel like with the internet, there's just more awareness maybe. And, there's great documentaries. Right. I think that's culmination, but for sure, I don't know which one of the big producers it is, but I think getting it in like the grocery stores really made it like a big movement. Like, oh, like I can buy bison, and it is like, this like cool, wild thing. And I think people just have gravitated towards that. But I think you're right about the paleo community. I mean, grass-fed meat, right, has just skyrocketed.
Totally.
Now it's almost like become a greenwashing thing. A cow ate grass, it's grass fed, but it spends 60% of its time in a feedlot, which brings to me the next topic is that the bison industry, I will say this, from a health perspective, when I was like getting into all this like 4 years ago, I don't know who said it, was on a podcast somewhere, they're like, bison are like much more likely to be like 100% grass fed because it's like a more natural diet. I don't know. And this was like the connotation in the health space. And then, in the last year, I've learned that this is absolutely not the case. And actually predominantly, especially all the bison in grocery stores, is very grain finished. So maybe you could shed some light on that or why that is. And
well, I think so. Probably 90% of bison, I mean, that's probably fairly accurate, are, it could be a little less, but it's a huge percentage of bison are actually finished in feedlots on grain. And so most people don't realize that. We have this kind of idealistic image of them grazing on the pastures, which they should be, and that's where I stand on that. But I think the bison industry in a lot of ways has adopted the cattle, I guess conventional cattle model, and there's reasons for that. So they put on weight faster and cheaper in a feedlot when being fed grain, especially when it's coming from subsidized, chemical input, totally propped up by, I'm sure you've dug into the industrial agriculture system, but, there's a reason why those grains are so cheap is because they're so subsidized and with all this abundant energy and fossil fuel that we pour into it. And so then that in turn, they're able to get a greater financial return on that. And, in a way it's misleading in a lot of ways it's misleading to consumers, because you never see a picture of a bison standing in a feedlot on their marketing material. You never do. So,
to me, it's like, and there's such a spectrum too. That's where I get kind of upset, because it's like, all right, if you like, bison are so lean, right? So it's almost like I feel like they do this as well to, I mean, even more so to just get some fat and some more marbling on the steaks.
Because that's what the American consumer's been trained to eat, right? And that's,
even like 100% grass-fed like beef steak, like, people look at that and be like, oh, it doesn't look good, it's not marbled enough. And it's like, intramuscular fat is not a sign of health, people. Like, Wagyu beef is bullshit. But for the bison and beef too, it's like, it gets finished on grain, but it's like, what is the spectrum? Like, how long? Because I was talking to people at the bison conference, and the stat that I didn't know is that the majority of the meat sold in the bison industry is from bulls. I think 2/3. You can correct me there, but as someone also said that they're spending like over half or maybe half their time in a feedlot, which sounds insane. That's a big difference from like what Stefan Van Fleet was talking about, which is like 3 months or whatever it was, 3 months versus, 2 years. Like, we're talking about really a big difference.
And he was studying Ted Turner's operation, and Ted Turner is the largest bison owner in the world, and he's the largest grassland owner in the United States. So he runs about 50,000 bison. I say he, Ted's not out, moving the bison, but he's got an elaborate, pretty incredible organization called Turner Ranches that manage 13 different bison ranches across about 2 million acres. And in order for them to build a consistent supply chain, and that's another part of it, is consistency throughout the year for our food system, the way it's set up. We want things on demand. We want things
supermarket.
Consistent.
We need it now.
So we need it now. It's got to be the exact same. Whereas in a grass finishing model, we're looking at the changing of the seasons, and we're looking at the forage quality, the animals grazing on this rising plane of nutrition through the spring and the summer. And then when fall hits, the forage starts to decline in quality. And that's when the animals get harvested, because that's the way nature works. But so in that scenario, in Turner's operation, they have a restaurant chain called Ted's Montana Grill. And so they I think are doing what you're saying and doing a little bit less time in the feedlot itself. And they're moving to a lot more of a grass-fed program, rightfully so. Turner Enterprises pushing a lot of really positive things in the bison business. They've got the resources to do it, and the people in that organization are solid and have the right intentions. So yeah, it's a really interesting topic. And I think what it comes down to is it costs a lot more time and money to finish that animal on grass. And you'd think, oh, well, why does it cost more money? Aren't they just eating grass? That grass costs money. That grass could be going to another animal that could be, potentially higher in value, some of those types of things. It just costs more money versus the propped up grain industrial system. So in order for, say, somebody like you or I to start a bison herd and graze these animals for 2.5 at a minimum to 3 years, potentially more, to actually kind of truly grass finish them, that we need to charge a lot of money for that meat. So it really comes down to, are you able to, it's great, you can produce a really good product, but then how do you get it into the hands of the consumer and tell that story so they're willing to pay you 16 or 17 bucks a pound for ground bison? And that's easier said than done. So that's a challenge. That's a limit to scaling grass-fed bison.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about that today, the nutrient density, because it's this is where I really get excited. It's if you have these 4, 5, 6-year-old bulls, they're probably packing on the phytochemical content compared to, your average grass-fed, even 100% grass-fed beef cow is 2 years, probably max. Industrial feedlot beef is probably 16 months. I don't know the difference between industrial style or feedlot bison. It's probably a little younger, but still inherently we need to be able to, convince consumers that you actually are getting more nutrient density. And that's why, what Stefan Bumfleet's doing is so cool.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's just interesting to think, because to me, and we've talked about it on this podcast a lot, and you mentioned subsidies, food prices have been held so artificially low for so long. $1.99 a pound chicken. Are you serious?
Yeah.
That's not real. That is a facade.
Yeah.
And you know why it costs that much? Because they're living in the absolute worst possible environments, chock full of whatever, just so they can make it to slaughter. And they're, in 40 days doing broilers or whatever it is now. It's insane. So I think the percentage that people spend on their budget on food has dropped drastically in the past 100 years. And, also they're just wasting money going out to eat. So, I've sold bison at the farmer's market, and for sure, I had to think about it, because at first I was $30-something a pound for a steak, like a ribeye or New York. And people are holy shit, who's going to pay that? But then I started pricing them in like 6 and 8 ounce steaks. And it's like, oh, $15, $17 for a steak. Oh, that sounds reasonable. It's the same price per pound.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just because like, oh, if you go out to eat a bison steak, oh, you buy a bison steak in Jackson Hole where I was just at, I mean, that's like $75. Even if you buy a ribeye, like a grain finished ribeye at Outback, it's like what, $35-$40?
Yeah.
With tax, tip, and the whole 9 yards. I mean, it's just like, put it into perspective. And I think this is what we need to do. And that's what we try and do here. It's like educate people that it is worth paying more for food. And there's a reason that it's priced that way. It's because that animal was 4 years old, not 16 months grain finished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's a totally an emerging field that Stefan Van Vliet is kind of at the forefront of testing nutrient density in these animals and relating it to the health of the soil. And so that's another huge part of what I do is, as we're looking to regenerate landscapes, ultimately it's about the health of the soil. And the health of the soil produces a healthy plant, and then that goes through the animal and into the human. And so, just because an animal has been quote unquote grass fed doesn't necessarily mean that it's super nutrient dense, that it's all these things, because quite frankly, every single farm and ranch in the world, unless people have been actively regenerating it over the last 30 years, is degraded. So our soils have been degraded. The nutrients are stripped away. To what degree varies completely depending on where you are in the past management. But I mean, we're talking billions of acres that have been completely stripped of their organic matter, which is carbon, the most important nutrient, all of the major macronutrients, micronutrients, and their water holding capacity. And then on top of that, we sprayed the shit out of them with all these chemicals and fertilizers, and they're dead. So, there's this continuum of, how healthy is that animal if it's come off of pasture that was farmed and sprayed for 80 years and has been reseeded to grass that probably has been sprayed itself, and we introduce animals to that could be considered grass-fed, versus a regenerative ranch on, say, native grasslands that's never had any sort of chemicals, abused to a much lesser degree. And the managers, the people that are out there on the ground, are making decisions to improve the health of that land over time, and that just compounds on itself. And once you restore the soil microbiology and balance the minerals and get carbon and get your water cycle functioning again, that's when we really start to see this nutrient density go through the plants and go up into the animal.
Are you interested in 100% grass-fed, grass-finished bison meat? I'm excited to be a partner with Falls Family Ranches. Based in Wyoming, Falls Family Ranches is raising high-quality bison meat the way nature intended. As a native large ruminant of North America, bison is one of the most nutrient-dense foods you can consume. If you're interested in trying out their bison boxes, use code Tristan, TRISTAN, 10 for 10% off your first order.
The diversity as well of the plant species, right?
Absolutely. Diversity is huge. We were just, a colleague of mine, Roland Cruz, who's a regenerative agriculture consultant who's focused on bison for many, many years. He and I, were consulting on 2 ranches in Wyoming, both practicing regenerative ag. The one was a big bison ranch and the other was a big cattle ranch. And these people are doing just an incredible job of taking agency and actively restoring that land and to the best of their abilities. And they are, choosing to approach this with an open mind and changing their practices, which is hard for people. This is a multi-generation ranch, and what they've done over the last few years, they've increased the diversity of their plants, and just through some simple changes in resting certain pastures for an additional year, especially in these drier, arid regions. Generally, what we don't do is let the pasture recover for a long enough period of time. A lot of these dry systems, like you mentioned earlier, the bison, they may have grazed it and probably didn't come back for multiple years, maybe up to 5 years. And that's how these prairies were built. And so this family, we were up on the top of the Bighorn Mountains, and they had rested this pasture for 2 years. And we were, doing monitoring transects, sampling soil, and looking at the plant communities, the amount of bare ground. And we're seeing just this incredible regeneration. We're seeing over 40 different species of plants in this extremely healthy soil. And the animals grazing that, so the wild ruminants, the elk up there, their cattle, the other wildlife species, they're going to be getting so much more from that versus the land, say, further out that's been farmed and really just stripped of its life. So it's so amazing to see people take this into their own hands, and ultimately they know that by improving the health of the soil, that's improving the resiliency of their land and ultimately security for their family.
Yeah, I love hearing stories like that. I think it's so empowering. And I mean, all this comes back to it's like a positive feedback loop, and it's also logic, right? If you treat the land the way nature intended, you emulate it, you're going to have higher quality soil, and that's going to give you higher quality forage. It's going to give you higher quality meat. You're going to be able to charge a premium, because it is more nutrient dense.
And then a higher quality of life, ultimately, because that's what we all want, right?
Exactly. It's a win-win for everyone, like the planet, the consumer and the producer. So my question is, what's your gauge on the receptiveness to regenerative holistic management? It's become pretty popular. At least it seems like it.
Yeah, it sure does.
So yeah, the last 5 years, there's documentaries, Joel Salatin, Gabe Brown, if you're in the space, household names, Alan Savory, White Oak Pastures, Will Harris on Joe Rogan. It's become much more prevalent in society, but I still feel a lot of producers are probably pretty apprehensive. So I'm curious, on your gauge on how this trend is moving.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think the last 5 years, I've been immersed in this world, whether, it's bison, regenerative, and ranching in general especially on the regenerative side for about 6 years. And I can really sense that the last 5, it's just building and building and building. Whether or not we're at a tipping point, I don't think we're quite there. But ultimately, yeah, people who are involved in agriculture are looking for a better way because the current system is not working. A lot of people are desperate on the cropping side of things. If we kind of separate the grazing, ranching, and the cropping farming side, the farming side is, for one, especially in this country, is completely propped up by subsidies, and farmers are trapped. They're in this degenerative loop where they are, their land's degrading. They're having to apply more and more chemical every single year, and all their equipment costs are just soaring. Everything's soaring out of control, and they're only able to make it because of the subsidies. If we strip those away, there would be a lot of tragedy, a lot of lost livelihoods, and those types of things.
Or the crop insurance, right?
That's
paycheck.
Yeah, that's part of the subsidies.
Okay, yeah,
exactly. And so, but they did that in New Zealand, where they pulled the rug out and said, hey, I don't know whether they couldn't afford the subsidies anymore or what, but there was a lot of people that, if they went down kicking and screaming, but ultimately were forced to change their ways and become inventive and entrepreneurial and start to actually focus on regenerating the land. New Zealand's not perfect by any means, but that was a case of what happened when they removed those. Now, if you did that in America, I would say that, we'd probably be forced to go back to more of an American spirit of entrepreneurism and actually figuring out how we can make this work and not relying on and just feeding the profits of big business, big agribusiness.
Yeah, I don't think Monsanto is going to let that happen.
Yeah, exactly. So, right. And you say that, but anything can happen.
No, it's the right attitude to have. I think there is a really tremendous momentum. And I think it's because of people like you are out there with boots on the ground. We're trying to spread education. Like, it all makes a difference, right? Like, even if you convince one person and educate them on regenerative agriculture, holistic management, and the problems with their centralized system, you're doing a great job. And that's like just going to continue, because the way I see it is really like ultimately consumers do dictate like market trends, because they're the ones, paying for the product. And, there could be a bunch of producers. Let's say tomorrow, 20% of livestock producers in the United States switch to holistic management. Is there that many consumers who are willing to pay the premium? I don't know. Probably not right now, to be honest.
Probably not. I mean, people are pinched. I don't know what,
especially inflation.
Absolutely.
Everything.
So, but I think that it comes down. I've thought about this a lot, and the work that you're doing to raise awareness and really connect to consumers, I think that's kind of the missing piece. We don't have as many of those people in this space. We've got a lot of people that are focused on the land health side of things, like I am, and the people actually in their businesses. Like, it's more than a full-time job just to produce what you're producing, right? Let alone to be, that's why it's like I totally am on board with the decentralization aspect of direct to consumer, and I've done that myself for 10 years. But you can't produce a high quality product, regenerate your land, and be at the farmer's market without getting burnt out. You can do it, right? So that's part of the issue. We need more people like you in the space who are really diving deep into what's going on the ground, understanding that piece, connecting that to consumers, and just building that up. Whether or not it can or will scale, I don't know. I think we just need to keep pushing. Back to the, whether or not producers are catching on to it. I think it's easier on the grazing side of things, because most people who are ranching, they're already kind of working within a somewhat ecological system, even if they're managing somewhat conventionally. It's easier to make some transitions on their pasture and just move their herds a bit differently and adopt a little bit of new technology, and you're off to the races. Ultimately, it's about the mindset change, though. Cropping, it's more difficult because, these systems are so degraded, and to grow annual crops requires a lot more moving pieces, and those landscapes are like methadone situations where they're addicted to those inputs, and to transition takes a few years. So that's between the two types of production agriculture. I'd say it's easier on the ranching side.
Yeah, no, I can see that, like, for sure. Cropping, it just seems like so much harder, like, across the board for very little, margin. But yeah, in general, I think people need to think of it from a perspective as well, like outside of meat, that it's like we need to get all these climate people on board. It's like, you want to fix the earth, like, this is how you do it. If you care about carbon emissions, which probably most people who listen to this podcast don't, but like, it's not about carbon. Well, it's about carbon sequestration, right? Because that's like the currency of like life underground, but it's about just biodiversity. Improving biodiversity, increasing life in a system. Like, do you care about the planet? Well, I would hope you do, but like, this is it, like, right here. And what's cool is thinking about how much untapped potential there is, like public lands, like BLM land, for example. And there's a couple guys like RC Carter and Intensely, we're going to talk to soon, is out on BLM land, like moving his cattle like frequently, and he's seeing like great results after just like 1 year. And that's how we build a more resilient system. And people are always talking about how much land and is wasted and everything like that, but obviously there's a lot of nuance in that. So I'm curious in general on other regenerative principles And I know at your time at Rome Ranch, you guys experiment with like multi-species grazing and things like that. Is that something that, a lot of people are implementing, or, what else is like, frontiers of regenerative holistic management that's kind of cool, or you think stuff like that works well? I feel like there's a lot of things that get thrown around and they're all like in the, test facilities. Like,
yeah. That's a great question. I love that question. So from my time at Rome Ranch, some of the stuff that we were trying, as far as we were rotating our bison according to our grazing plans, and trying to regenerate the land through bison grazing, also doing seeding cover crops on degraded land, which some of the land was so degraded that you could barely even get a cover crop to grow, which is like, wow, that's crazy. As far as running the multi-species, I think that a lot of the monogastric, the poultry, the pigs, anything that's reliant on outside feed, and feed that is inevitably produced in an energy dense situation. And I say energy dense to produce it, driving the tractors, the fertilizer, the seed, the chemicals, and then the transportation. I'm not too big on that. I think that it's great, and a lot of people can pull it off, or some people can pull it off. I think most people are going to have a really hard time with that, especially given the last few years with the price of diesel. I don't see that going down. I don't see the cost of purchasing those grains that are required to feed those animals to become a better value proposition. That being said, I think the poultry and that type of thing, you can manage them in a way that really can give you a boost in nutrients on your land, and it can be done. White Oak Pasture is doing a pretty good job of it. Again, where's that feed coming from? I think it's real energy, interesting energy. If they were to run the quantum life cycle analysis on the poultry, and I mean, Will Harris, he'll say openly that they lose money on their poultry anyways. And so how much of it is it worthwhile? It's like, that's why I've kind of went away from eating a lot of chicken, really. Just go back to bison and elk. Some cool stuff that I saw. We had some mentors, Chad and Ronna Lemke out of Mason, Texas. They were holistic management mentors of ours. And on their ranch, they were running multi-species, but they were running their large mob of cattle, large mob of sheep, and a large herd of goats all in one herd. And they would move them all together. And they were in this kind of brushy, grassy savanna landscape where it was perfect for all of those species. And they were able to just get so much more out of the land. And the results of that is incredible. I mean, they've created this, dream-like savanna, like you'd envision in Africa, really, on their ranch. So from a multi-species standpoint, I think there's a lot that can be done with goats, especially goats, because they can eat anything, right? We're out in Wyoming in this kind of sagebrush country, and
antelopes are like speed goats, basically, right? So
yeah. Well, yeah. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you know the closest living relative of the antelope?
I mean, is it a mountain goat?
No, like they're so
because they're not actually real antelopes, right? Like they're called pronghorns. They're not actually real antelopes. That's all I know.
Yeah, they're completely own genus, and they were totally separated. I don't want to venture a guess how many hundreds of thousands of years ago from everything else. But their closest living relative is a giraffe. Yeah, isn't that crazy?
What?
Yeah,
I could kind of see it actually in the neck.
Yeah,
it's like very straight and long. Wow.
Yeah,
that's so weird.
It's crazy.
They are very weird.
They're
look weird.
Such interesting creatures.
They're fast, but this is good meat, and they'll eat the sagebrush. But that makes a lot of sense. The multi-species grazing, because it's like, I guess, what is the definition of like regenerative? To me, like what you're talking about is like, to me, is like, is it self-sufficient? And clearly with monogastrics, the answer is no. It can almost never be. But are they adding any benefit to regenerating the land that the ruminants would not have covered, or is there any additional benefit?
Absolutely. So I mean, so in the sense that, for example, we had talking in Texas, we had some extremely degraded land, the worst land I've ever seen, and the birds alone, we're not going to solve that, but we rolled out hay for a carbon source, which that hay was imported, so there was a whole bunch of embedded fossil fuel energy in that. And I'm not like anti-fossil fuel, but it's a cost, and
it's just an energy cost.
It's an energy cost. And so, we rolled out that carbon source because the soil was completely devoid of carbon. And then we ran the chickens on top of that, and then seeded the cover crop into that patch. We seeded the whole field. The patches where we didn't have the hay and the nitrogen and all the phosphorus and all the micronutrients that the poultry was providing. Where we didn't do that, we didn't get any growth. And where we did, the cover crops were like 6 feet tall. So, I mean, yeah, you can pour money into the system in terms of nutrients, in terms of carbon and everything that we're missing. But I mean, it comes with a cost, right? And so is that scalable, sustainable, whatever? I don't know. Yeah. So I always like to look at it that way. What would this look like if diesel fuel went to $20 a gallon? Because it very well could,
I guess my question is, if you had a herd of bison or a herd of cattle and then ran a flock of chickens after, like, the nice theory of you run the chickens after, or ducks, whatever, turkeys, and they eat the fly larva, and it helps with, parasitic load, and it's food for, the birds.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be more of an added benefit to the land, like on top of what the bison or cattle are doing in terms of regeneration, that it's enough to justify, like, running a flock of birds that would still need some external feed? Or is it the quantity? Are they just doing way too many birds, and really we need, like, 5 birds?
Well, again, I totally.
But
see.
I'm just,
spitballing. So there's this is something that Joel Salatin's preached forever. I know plenty of people who've done it, tried it, become frustrated with it, and stopped doing it because it just wasn't worth their time. That being said, it totally can be done if if those birds are a part of this marketing program where you're selling your birds for a premium and you're getting that out of them, plus the added benefit. Because ultimately, the birds have to be producing, or whether it's eggs or whatever, the birds have to be producing a saleable product for that equation to work out. But based on what my experience, it can be done. It can be done. I just think that, it's another labor unit. Labor's short everywhere. So, like, is somebody's labor at 15 to, I don't know what minimum wage is around here, but you know what I mean? To try to get somebody to move birds, or if that's what you're spending your time doing, that there's a trade-off, there's an opportunity cost. And what we find is people, get enchanted by the idea of homesteading, doing all these things, try it for a while and realize that, okay, there's a reality to it. And it's fun, it's cool. And some people stick with it. And I think that's awesome. Like, I eat eggs every single day, but I choose to go buy them from somebody who's committed to doing it properly versus me doing it myself. Running the birds behind the livestock, that's an interesting one. I think that there is a benefit to definitely what you're talking about, them scratching through the patties and getting the larvae. But at the same time, if we focus on getting this healthy rumen function and empowering our dung beetles to do most of that work anyways and bury it in the soil, if the dung beetles are able to go to town and disperse that patty as much as they can into the soil, we don't have as many fly larvae issues in general as well. So, there's different things that we can do. And I'd say just like working more with nature, trying to get this like ruminant system functioning. And then, if you're into that and you want to go for that stacking enterprises, by all means, But I think the narrative that has been sold to a lot of people is kind of been a little bit misleading. Love Joel Salatin, all that stuff, but you can farm as I've read his book and all that stuff. It's not for everybody, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. It seems like it's more work.
It's a lot of work.
The ROI seems lower. I just always think about it. It's really interesting. I personally also don't consume a lot of chicken or pork at all. Also because the quality, it is really hard to find quality pork and chicken. Yeah. And that's like what it comes down to. So if you are homesteading and you don't have, the acreage, and definitely you can go for it. I think it's a good option, but it seems to me that it would make sense from like a self-sustaining or like regenerative or just energy perspective. Say you have a farming operation outside of a town, and this town has like a food processor and there's just a ton of scraps. Yeah. Then that makes sense. Go for it. Like the food scraps, the food waste, or your neighbor is growing, whatever crop, you turn the hogs on to, root it all up and they get some feed there. So I'm all for that, but those are like unique circumstances, I think. But then,
that's interesting you bring that up too. I'm all for backyard hens. They're easy, and like you say, kitchen scraps. And, if you're somehow able to make that work without a lot of, just expensive, because you end up producing like $20 a dozen eggs. Like, who wants to do that? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, inherently, it's like like renewable energy, right? It doesn't work at scale, and the only reason chicken, pork really works at scale is because of the living condition, the industrial farming system. Like that's the only reason. I think ruminants, they're so much more resilient. They can consume diverse pastures. Like you're saying, you could do the multi-species grazing, just do different ruminants. And it's once you get the system down, to me it seems like probably less effort.
Mm-hmm. For sure, it absolutely is. And when we look at designing those systems, whether you're just starting out or you're an established producer with land, with a property, a ranch, farm, it always ends up circling back to water. It always ends up back at water. We start to say, okay, well, all right, so in order to achieve the goals I want to achieve, which is improving the health of my land and producing a healthy animal food, we want to start rotating them across the land. Oh, well, we don't have water everywhere. So then we need to figure out, okay, how do we install infrastructure and systems, kind of like we were looking at today, to be able to pull that off and make that happen. And so I think that there's so much opportunity in the world of water, I guess, and from the regenerative side of things, because it's really the key to making it all work. If we don't have good water systems, the fencing part, that's easy, but the water, man, it's the ticket. I just find it so interesting, looking at a property and saying, okay, what are my water sources and what do we have to work with, and how can we get that system designed in the ground, functioning, so it becomes easy and effortless. So you could manage it on the side, or you can manage it on weekends and that type of thing. I think that's a excellent path towards decentralization, is having more of those types of systems.
Yeah, water. Wow, water is so big. It's like, and it's really a hot topic right now, especially, I mean, you live in Utah or like Arizona or something. I mean, really, some of these places probably shouldn't exist. Phoenix, Las Vegas, literally these cities make no sense, and they pump so much water. And I mean, most of it's used for like golf courses, but a lot of it's used for agriculture, and a lot of it's for animal agriculture. And I often, think about this, and it's obviously one way to improve water utilization is to improve the quality of the soil, right? Organic matter dramatically increases water holding capacity. But, is there a happy medium there? And it's,
as far as what?
Just like, how do we how do we become better with water utilization? And, is agriculture like a big problem? And yeah, to me, it seems like the answer is yes. And the solution is improving the health of the soil.
Yeah.
But that's, again, it's an uphill battle, but it's one that, Diana Rogers always talks about, gray and blue water. Like most of the water, she says something like 95+% of the water is like naturally occurring in the environment for beef. Which,
right. It's already falling on that land.
I think that number is, I don't know. Like it seems high because I do see a lot of irrigation happening like anywhere, like to be honest. And is that sustainable? I just don't know.
Yeah, well, in a lot of cases, a lot of, say, the alfalfa production, alfalfa is one of the best forages on the planet. It's called the queen of the forages. Like, it's an amazing feed. But we grow it in such vast quantities in monocultures under irrigation, then to bale it up, take the carbon away, and collapse the soil structure, and then ship the bales off to Asia. There's this massive market of North American hay that goes to Asia. And so is that
baling it is bad, really bad for the soil health?
Yeah. So hay, so anytime that, if you can imagine, you've got this lush field of grass that has grown up, and you take it and you cut it off and you roll it up in a big bundle, and then you take it away from your farm. That, I like to think of a bale of hay as a big bundle of carbon, a big bundle of nutrients. It's full of, every mineral that you can imagine, right? The big piece being carbon, which is what we need more of in our soils. So you remove that, and especially if you do it every single year for 100 years, we soil sample hay fields, and often they're down to, a healthy soil would be anywhere from 6 to 10% organic matter. And often these hay fields that have been stripped and stripped and stripped and stripped every single year for 100 years, they're so compacted, they can't get water into the soil, and they're about 1 to 2% organic matter. So they've been mined out essentially. So that's what hay is. Hay is a tool, I think. It's a tool to, support different land management, but a whole operation should not be based on hay because it's uneconomical. And, it worked well when, it was 1950 and we just had like gusher oil wells, where gas was so cheap. Diesel was like, pennies per gallon, and our soils were still healthy and they still had a lot of carbon back in the soil. That also makes me think too, this is a really interesting thing. I don't know how many of your listeners are deep into agriculture, but they'll find this interesting. I have a farmer who lives near me in southern Alberta who, all of these problems we were talking about related to soil health, he was trying to figure this out 20 years ago. His crop yields were going down. He was paying too much for nitrogen fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer. And so he had this crazy idea to experiment and take the exhaust from his tractor and pipe it basically back into the soil, because the exhaust is old plant material from diesel fuel from millions of years ago. Anyways, long story short, 20 years into the future, in 2023, this thing is called bioactive carbon farming. And this is the real deal. So they take the exhaust from the tractor, and run it through what they call this fusion tank. And it cools the exhaust, and it goes into this pool of water in the tank, and it creates this soupy carbon brew. So it's carbon, minerals, everything. And then they have 2 side tanks on the fusion tank that have microbes that mix in there and create like this ultimate brew of soil amendment. And then that goes back out to the drill or whatever implement they're using to seed their crops, and it's pumping it back into the soil. So they're returning carbon back into the soil, and they're seeing these incredible results. And so multiple things that's doing. Most of these farms, these conventional farms, depending on the size, they're spending millions on fertilizer and herbicide now. It's getting completely out of control. They're unable to make money. With this system, they're able to go cold turkey on fertilizer and way reduce their chemical rates down to fractions of what they were. And they're getting the same or better crops, and their soil health is improving. And so I've just been fascinated by this. And this is like the ultimate in decentralization. All of these farmers are already buying the diesel fuel. And in agriculture, these pieces of equipment are not going to be electrified. I mean, they might play around with it, but we're going to be using diesel for a long time. So why not just use what we're already using, which is carbon, put it back in the soil, improve the health of our soil, and it's like this virtuous cycle.
Is that something you just like attach to like your vehicle or something? Or
you could, it's really interesting. And like I say, their farm is near where I live. So I happened to just stumble upon these guys, and you go out to their farm and there's like a whole boneyard of early experiments that they have done, like rototillers and lawnmowers with like exhaust pipes pointed at the ground. And so in theory, you could just do that. You could collect the exhaust from the carbon and in fact just foliar spray it on the plants. And they do that at their manufacturing facilities is somewhat remote. So they run it off a diesel generator and then collect all the exhaust off of that into what they call carbon water and mix microbes in it and then sell it as foliar spray to enhance crop health. So it's really interesting.
That's cool. I mean, yeah, I was going to ask you what you're most excited about, but I think you just answered it.
I'm pretty excited about that.
No, that's awesome. Like I think the innovation like is, if we can keep this like within the system, like maybe it needs to be in a different form, like you're saying, adding microbes for more benefit. But yeah, it makes total sense. It's, we're taking it from the earth in the form of fossil fuels. Like we could return some of it back potentially.
Absolutely.
But I want to go back to the hay for a second because that's really interesting. I'm definitely gonna have to tell my sister because I think they're about to bale their first alfalfa crop since they just moved onto land. But
right.
Ideally, I was like, why don't you just have someone come graze it or but probably make a lot more money on the hay. So. But that's really interesting. And then that makes me think is like how, especially in like Wyoming, Canada, it's really cold in the winter, right? Like that's when a lot of this is getting fed to livestock. Is that, unsustainable? Is that another reason why bison are superior? Because they can, be more resilient in the winter and punch through the soil. Is that another reason, going back to what you're saying, and I'm 100% on board with this, the cyclicality and seasonality, like, needs to be respected.
You're 100% right. It's a great point. And that is another reason why bison are, they have their advantages because they can do that. They can forage through deep snow on low quality forage. And, generally like depending on what species of plants you have on the rangeland or the pasture, they can winter graze and get through, in a lot of, say, cattle systems and bison, what we see producers shifting more towards, if they're serious about actually making money, is they're trying to graze as long into the winter as possible, and then just supplementing with a little bit, say, just 5% of the animal's daily requirement, say, with a little bit of alfalfa, to really just kind of keep those rumen microbes humming and keep them supercharged, so then they're able to digest the lower quality forage that's out on the land. So absolutely. So then we can move from a system where it's substitutional feeding, so we're substituting the hay in for the grass that they could graze, to a more of a supplementation. So that's where the producers that are serious about running this as a business are going.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. Hay is so expensive. Like, yeah. I mean, who can afford? I mean, this past winter is pretty much 5-6 months anywhere, in the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
Who can afford to feed their animals like majority of, hay? And it's
well, that brings up another interesting point too. A lot of landscapes are not set up to be a year-round cow-calf herd. If you're up to your armpits in snow for 6 to 8 months a year, like in where I live, we do get quite a bit of snow like that. Is it suitable to have that cow herd on that piece of land all year long? Or can we develop systems where we are more migratory with our animals, whether we're bringing in somebody else's animals, or we have an arrangement where we have a winter range and somewhere where it's more suitable, that type of thing. That's something we see over and over. It's just the choice of the enterprise doesn't match the environment.
Yeah, I think between water and nutrients and breed species, like, yeah, it's there's so many mismatches going on, and it's being forced, and eventually, something's going to crack, and you're just not going to be able to continue it. But then it's like, there's an inherent blame placed on something, right? Whether it's fertilizer costs, hay costs, and things like that.
People are always looking to be the victim and looking for a scapegoat instead of recognizing, oh, okay, well, the way we've been doing things was maybe just a giant experiment all along and was never set up to succeed. So we better adapt, or we just go tits up.
I think people just need to take a good, long, hard look at like the environment that they're in and think of, what would thrive here, what would, survive here, and what is the difference between that, and, suit your product to the land, not the land to the product, or maybe I'm saying that backwards, but like, people have an idea of what they want before they even, start something. And it's really like, you can't just do Black Angus in Alberta probably all year round without a ton of hay, I'd imagine. I don't know. That's just an example, but that's why, kind of wrapping up here, the bison just makes sense, right? Like, this is their land. They're built for North America. I think the part, of the heat is really astounding, and it makes sense too. Cause I mean, we're here in Wyoming too, it's 90 degrees, they need to have that very large, cause the Great Plains, their temperature fluctuations are crazy, right? Like, there's no, regulation usually from like, coastal areas, large bodies of water. So bison are used to that. And it's just astounding to see that type of resilience. So yeah, Cody, it's a great chat. Appreciate you coming through. Excited to see everything, kind of propel forward. But people want to find out more about you or what you do, I don't know. Where can they find you?
Well, if somebody wants to reach out to me just directly, if they're, I guess, serious about bison, regenerative agriculture, just shoot me an email, cody@sweetgrassbison.ca. And yeah, just keep an eye out for the Wild Bison podcast. It's going to be launched this fall.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, my friend Ty Stubblefield and I. And so we're gonna dig deep into conversations like this, bison specific, getting back to the land, and how do we get back to the land and live a meaning of life and prosperity. And there'll be a lot of conversations about hunting, about the business side of what we're doing, and just really trying to dig into it and share this journey with people.
Yeah, that's badass. Wow. Really looking forward to that. I think, yeah, these things are all very decentralized, right? That's why we love it here. I mean, the hunting aspect, trying to get more, folks talking about hunting on this podcast. I think it's nothing more empowering and decentralized than going to acquire your own food.
Yeah.
And doing it the real way. I would also say, I think hunting, there's a spectrum to everything, right?
Yeah.
Hunting, raising livestock, whatever. You could sit in a stand all day and have corn in your field just for the whitetails to come through, or you could hike 40 plus miles over like 5 days.
Yeah. Well, and I don't mean to drag it on, but that's a great, interesting conversation about, like, from the bison side of things. Like, you could go out onto a bison ranch and hunt a bison. It's not a hunt. It's not a free not free range, but fair chase. But that is better than hauling a bison to an industrial slaughter plant. So, like, it's such a continuum.
Yeah, it's like the field harvest. I think that's super cool. And I like, Rome Ranch and a lot of other bison ranches do these kind of, ceremonies around the harvest. I think it's good. Get people educated on what goes into, harvesting an animal, the life, you pay respect to it. And
yeah,
I mean, that's fresh meat right there. You don't have to go to, knock on the old USDA processor with all those rules if you get it.
Yeah,
Right
so
there
you
on the
mentioned
spot.
them, but I want to, if people are serious in the US about buying high quality bison meat, I go to Wild Bison Ranch in Montana. My friend Ty Stubblefield, we helped him get his ranch going, and he's doing a lot of cool regenerative stuff there. North Bridger Bison, Matt Skoglund in Montana as well. And kind of the godfather of a lot of this field harvest stuff, Dan O'Brien, Wild Idea Buffalo Company in South Dakota. They ship nationwide. They're amazing. So go check those guys out.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Cody. It's a great chat. Thanks everyone for tuning in to another episode of Decentralized Radio. See you next time.